The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television moments that make an entire nation stop what it is doing. Moments where the joke lands so hard, so precisely, that the laughter is almost uncomfortable. And then there are moments where a show pushes far enough past the acceptable boundary that the question stops being "was that funny?" and starts being "should that have been allowed at all?" Fawlty Towers managed to produce both kinds of moments, sometimes in the very same episode. It was a sitcom that never once apologized for itself, never once softened its edges, and never once allowed its central character the dignity of getting away with anything. But somewhere in those 12 glorious episodes, one scene in particular crossed an invisible line. Not quietly, and not politely, but with a goose-step through the lobby and a finger pressed above the lip. And the consequences of that single moment would echo for decades, pulling the show in and out of circulation, dividing critics, enraging fans, and turning one half-hour of British comedy into one of the most debated pieces of television ever broadcast. To understand why that scene landed the way it did, you have to understand what kind of show Fawlty Towers actually was, not the legend, not the reputation, but the thing itself, in the room, in the moment it first appeared. When it debuted on BBC One in September of 1975, expectations were far from grand. It was a sitcom about a failing hotel on the English Riviera, run by a man who appeared to genuinely resent the guests who kept him in business. There was no warmth at the center of it, no lovable protagonist working through relatable problems. Instead, there was Basil Fawlty, a man of ferocious snobbery, bottomless self-deception, and an almost supernatural ability to make every situation worse than he found it. He looked down on working-class guests. He fawned over anyone he believed to be upper class. He was consistently wrong about which was which, and he suffered spectacularly for it every single time. Basil was not designed to be sympathized with. He was designed to be laughed at. The distinction matters enormously, because it is what gave the show its moral backbone. However offensive Basil became, however rude or bigoted or dishonest, the viewer always knew where the judgment fell. It fell on Basil. The universe of the show was not indifferent to his behavior, it punished him for it, reliably, completely, and without mercy. Every lie he told created 3 more lies he had to maintain. Every scheme he constructed collapsed under its own weight. Every moment of cruelty or condescension returned to him magnified. He was a man convinced of his own superiority who was, in every episode, proven comprehensively wrong. That was the engine. That was the joke. The show was built by 2 people working in close and disciplined collaboration. John Cleese, who played Basil, co-wrote every episode with Connie Booth, who also appeared in the series as Polly, the hotel's calm and capable maid. The character of Basil had been drawn, in part, from a real encounter. In the early part of the decade, Cleese and the rest of the Monty Python team had stayed at a hotel in Torquay run by a manager of such extraordinary hostility and incompetence that he seemed almost too absurd to be real. This man had thrown a guest's briefcase over a garden wall because he suspected it might be a bomb. He had corrected the table manners of another guest with the severity of a magistrate. He had treated every paying visitor as an intruder and every complaint as a personal insult. Cleese observed all of it with the attention of a writer who understood that this was material. Over the following years, working with Booth, he distilled that observation into something sharper, funnier, and more precisely structured than anything the original model could have provided. The result was 2 series of 6 episodes each, broadcast 4 years apart. The first series aired in 1975 and received a baffled response from some critics, who found the chaos deliberate and the comedy too dense to follow at speed. Audiences, however, understood it immediately. They saw the thing that critics had missed, that the mayhem was not a sign of poor construction but of extraordinary construction. The scripts were intricate mechanisms. Every comic disaster had been engineered down to the individual word. Every misunderstanding had been planted several scenes before it detonated. The show rewarded attention in a way that very few sitcoms ever have, and audiences gave it their attention willingly and in growing numbers. By the time the BBC finally commissioned a second series, for years after the first had ended, Fawlty Towers had accumulated a reputation that made the new episodes an event. They arrived in 1979 and confirmed everything the first series had promised. Episode after episode operated at a level of comic craftsmanship that has rarely been matched. And then, for episodes into the second series, came the Germans. The episode aired on the 24th of October, 1979. Its setup was, by the standards of the show, relatively straightforward. Basil sustains a head injury early in the episode, struck by a decorative moose head falling from the wall of his own hotel lobby, and the concussion he develops will, in the manner of all great farce, choose the single worst possible moment to make itself felt. His wife Sybil is in hospital for a minor procedure, managing the hotel remotely by telephone with the authority of a military commander. Manuel, the Spanish waiter, is managing to be both indispensable and catastrophic in roughly equal measure. A fire drill is staged, goes wrong, and contributes to the general disorder that is always building, always threatening, always about to become something else. Then the German tourists arrive. A group of polite, well-mannered German guests check into the hotel. They are entirely reasonable. They make no unusual demands. They are, by every measure, the most normal people in the building. Basil, concussed and increasingly unstable, greets them. He is almost painfully aware, that he must not, under any circumstances, make any reference to the Second World War. He issues the instruction to his staff in terms that could not be more direct. Don't mention the war. He says it as a man might say it who has already, on some level, understood that he is going to do precisely that. And then the machinery of farce takes over. The references begin small. A word here, a phrase there, each one Basil catches just barely in time, each one making the German guests look at him with slightly more confusion than before. But the concussion is working against him, loosening the controls that ordinarily keep his worst impulses in check, and the references do not stay small. They grow. They multiply. They acquire momentum. By the time the German guests are seated in the dining room, Basil Fawlty is no longer capable of containing what is happening inside him. He begins doing impersonations. He references the war openly, repeatedly, and with increasing theatrical commitment. And then, in the sequence that would define the episode's legacy, he holds a finger beneath his nose to indicate a small mustache, straightens his posture, and goose-sets across the floor of the dining room in imitation of Adolf Hitler. The studio audience in the room laughed. The television audience at home laughed. Millions of people watching across the United Kingdom laughed. And then, very shortly afterward, the letters began. The complaints arrived at the BBC in significant volume. They came from several different directions, expressing several different concerns. Some correspondents argued that the episode was treating the Second World War as comedy fodder, that a conflict which had killed tens of millions of people, which had scarred a generation, which was still within living memory for a large part of the audience, deserved more respect than to be the source material for a goose-step in a hotel dining room. Others argued that the German characters in the episode, repeatedly subjected to Basil's bizarre behavior, required to react with puzzled dignity to an Englishman's historical breakdown, were themselves the target of a kind of national caricature. And a smaller but vocal group found the Hitler impression specifically objectionable, regardless of the satirical context in which it appeared. BBC executives took the correspondence seriously enough to hold internal discussions about the episode. Those discussions were, by accounts that emerged later, genuinely heated. The question on the table was whether the Germans had crossed a line that the network was comfortable with, and if it had, what to do about it. In the end, the BBC chose not to pull the episode. It remained in circulation. It was repeated. It became, over time, the most quoted, most referenced, and most discussed episode in the entire run of the series. But the debate did not end there. It had, in a sense, only just begun. The argument that Cleese and others made in defense of the episode was precise and consistent. The joke in the Germans, they argued, was not aimed at Germany or at German people. It was aimed at England. It was a portrait of a very specific English pathology, the inability to let the war go, the tendency to define Germany exclusively through the lens of the Second World War, the awkward, self-defeating performance of history that Basil enacts in public at great cost to himself and to everyone around him. The German guests in the episode are not the targets of the comedy. They are its witnesses. They stand in the hotel dining room as reasonable people watching an Englishman publicly humiliate himself in front of them, and they react as reasonable people would, with confusion, discomfort, and eventually a request to leave. Basil is the fool. He is always the fool. The satire points inward, at England, at the peculiar English relationship with a war that had been over for 3 decades but which had never quite been processed. Cleese has made this point in interviews and in public statements many times over the years. The war jokes, he has said, were aimed at the British obsession with the war and at Basil's stupidity. The intention was clear. The execution was precise. The moral architecture of the show, which had always positioned Basil as the object of ridicule rather than its instrument, held firm even in this episode. And yet, the question of intent and the question of effect are not always the same question. Comedy that intends satire can still produce harm in audiences who lack the context to receive it as satire. When Fawlty Towers first aired, its British audience understood Basil. They had grown up with people like him. They recognized the type, the minor snob, the aspirational mediocrity, the man performing a version of English dignity that he could never quite live up to. They knew, instinctively, that the joke was on Basil. But the show did not stay within the borders of its original audience. It moved. It was exported. It was acquired by streaming platforms and made available to viewers around the world who had no particular familiarity with the English class anxieties from which the show had emerged, and for some of those viewers, the framing was less clear. This is what happened when the streaming controversies arrived. Decades after the episode first aired, platforms began to reevaluate their comedy catalogs with a set of concerns that had not existed, or had not been articulated in the same way, in 1979. Scenes that had been read as satire by one generation of viewers were being read differently by another. The Germans was removed from at least one streaming service. Edited versions appeared on others, with specific scenes cut or altered. In each case, the response from fans of the show was immediate and forceful. They argued that the edits misunderstood the show's purpose, that removing the scene was precisely the kind of misreading that Cleese had always warned against, and that treating audiences as incapable of understanding the context of a joke was its own form of condescension, perhaps the one form of condescension that Fawlty Towers had never indulged in. Cleese himself entered these later debates with the same energy he had brought to the original. He has never been someone who retreats from a position under social pressure, and he did not retreat from this one. He defended the episode, defended the scene, and defended the principle that satire should not be required to make its audience comfortable. Comedy that refuses to touch anything difficult, he argued, is not comedy, it is reassurance. And Fawlty Towers was never in the business of reassurance. What makes the case genuinely complex, what separates it from a simple story about censorship versus creative freedom, is that the concerns raised about the episode are not trivial. The history being referenced in the episode is not an abstract one. The war killed real people. Germany's relationship with that history has been one of sustained and serious national reckoning. For a German viewer with family members who lived through that period, a British sitcom in which an Englishman performs a Hitler impression for comic effect may land very differently than it lands for a British viewer raised on a particular tradition of ironic self-deprecation. The satirical frame does not automatically resolve that difficulty. It mitigates it. It does not eliminate it. And yet the Germans endured. It endured the original backlash, the streaming controversies, the edits, the removals, and the years of argument. It is still watched. It is still quoted. The phrase "don't mention the war" is still understood, in Britain and beyond, as a reference to something specific, a particular kind of self-defeating English anxiety, made comic and made permanent by the episode that gave it language. Behind the scenes of that second series, the human cost of making the show was its own story. Cleese and Booth had separated by the time filming began, though they continued to work together with professional precision. Andrew Sachs, who gave Manuel his particular combination of enthusiasm and catastrophe, suffered real physical harm in the making of the series. The frying pan used to strike Manuel in one scene was a real frying pan on the first take. It left a bruise. It was replaced with a rubber version, but the damage had already been done. Sachs was also burned during a fire sequence that went further than intended. He returned to the set without complaint. Prunella Scales, playing Sybil with the authority of someone who had made a decision about her husband long ago and was living with the consequences, brought a precision and a withering comic intelligence to a role that could easily have been reduced to caricature. It was not reduced to caricature. None of the performances were. That was what made the show what it was. 12 episodes. That was everything. Cleese and Booth chose to stop when the show was at its peak, and what they left behind was not a body of work that had worn out its welcome but one that ended before it could. That discipline, the refusal to keep going simply because the going was good, is part of what has preserved the show's reputation. There is no bad series of Fawlty Towers because there was no series of Fawlty Towers made after the inspiration had departed. The British Film Institute, in the year 2000, named Fawlty Towers the greatest British television series ever made. That ranking came from critics, scholars, and industry professionals, not from sentiment, but from a genuine assessment of what the show had achieved. It had taken the form of the situation comedy and pushed it to a structural and comedic precision that the form had never previously reached. It had created characters who were simultaneously recognizable types and utterly singular individuals. It had made audiences laugh at things that were not, on reflection, entirely comfortable to have laughed at. And in The Germans, it had produced a single episode that has generated more words of criticism, defense, analysis, and argument than most entire television series ever will. That is the legacy of the scene that brought Fawlty Towers to the edge of removal and kept it there, balanced, for the rest of its existence. Not off the air permanently. Not destroyed. But marked. Complicated. Unresolved. Which is, perhaps, exactly where great comedy belongs, not in the safe territory where everyone agrees, but in the harder place where the laughter and the discomfort are impossible to fully separate. Basil Fawlty goose-stepped across that dining room floor, and British television has never quite recovered from it. Whether that is a scandal or an achievement depends entirely on who you ask. And the fact that the answer is still genuinely contested, after all this time, might be the most Fawlty Towers thing about it.